We're going to start this second part of the research section by moving to the visual culture and the filmmaking. Yeah? We'll have three presentations. The first one will be by Antonio Somaini. Let me shortly introduce Antonio. Antonio Somaini is a professor of film media and visual culture theory at the Université Sorbonne Nouvelle in Paris, and a senior member of the Institut Universitaire de France. This combination of English, French, and Catalan makes them somehow difficult, but I think that the AI is doing better than me. Yeah. With a 5 years research project on the impact of AI on images, visual culture, and contemporary artistic practices. He's the chief curator of the exhibition Le Monde selon l'IA, The World Through AI, currently on view at the Jeu de Paume Museum in Paris until September the 21st. So if you have the opportunity to go to Paris, please, you can visit this exhibition. Among his latest publications, the article Algorithmic Images, Artificial Intelligence and Visual Culture, and a Theory of Latent Spaces, which I think is going to be the topic of Antonio's presentation today. The title is Latent Spaces as Meta-Archives, and the talk will discuss the idea that the latent spaces of generative AI models act as meta-archives in which vast quantities of cultural objects are encoded, stored, processed, and transformed. Thank you for being here, Antonio. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm very, very grateful for this invitation and for the impeccable organization of this event. So really thanks for getting me here from Paris. So yeah, the title is Latent Spaces as Meta-Archives, and it is very much based on the research and the work that I've done in curating this exhibition, currently on view at the Jeu de Paume. Why is this not moving? Here we go. Currently on view at the Jeu de Paume Museum in Paris. The title is Le Monde selon l'IA, The World Through AI. And it is an exhibition about how contemporary artists have reacted during the last 10 years to the increasing presence of all sorts of AI algorithms and models across all layers of contemporary societies, culture, economics, technologies, military operations, and so on. It is an exhibition that is accompanied by a catalog published both in English and in French with several essays. So it's a kind of a catalog book with a number of scholarly contributions by authors such as Kate Crawford, Noam Elcott, and many others. And the exhibition is also accompanied by a whole film program. That's why I'd like to mention it here, because I'm so happy to be here for the first time to actually follow this Plus Rain Festival. And we too had a series of 6 screenings, one of which in particular, the one that you see below to the left, Histoire potentielle, excavation de mémoire, potential histories, excavation of memories, is in a way related to what I'm going to be talking about today. The last of these events will be on July 8th, and we will have the pleasure of hosting Alexander Kluge, famous German documentary filmmaker, who at the age of 92 has started using generative AI to produce a whole series of very, very interesting films. The exhibition is organized across the 2 floors of the museum, and it is articulated across the different sections that you see here. On the ground floor, it's a question of the materialities of AI technologies, the labor that is involved in training AI models, and also artists using or reacting to different kinds of so-called analytic AI, meaning models and applications that are meant to perform operation of detection, recognition, classification, such as machine vision, face and emotional recognition, and so on. The first floor is instead entirely dedicated to generative AI and to the question of latent spaces, and it is articulated in the sections that you see there. We also have some artists from Barcelona, the collective Taller Estampa, who's presenting a very, very interesting new work entitled Ekphrasis, which is a video installation in which a series of film excerpts, for example, from Chris Marquer's Sans Soleil, are analyzed by different AI models as they move across the screen. And for each of these colored rectangles, there is a model that is trying to identify objects, recognize emotions, describe what the images show, or develop even some kinds of interpretation. I can show you a little excerpt here for just a few seconds. We need to probably raise at some point the volume.
Dans sa tête n'arrivent que des mots, décrochés des phrases, des mots seuls, des mots en liste, des paquets de mots. Il y a des mots qui sont dans sa tête, immobiles, suspendus, des mots qui sont des émotions, désir, douleur, dégoût.
So this is, the projection is actually not working very well. It's stopping a little bit. But in any case, the idea is to show that among the interesting transformations happening with the advent of all these models is the fact that all the relations between words and images, between the visible and the sayable, are reorganized by these models in such a way that you can generate or modify images starting from texts, but also generate texts starting from images. And another Barcelona-based artist we have in the exhibition is Joan Fontcuberta with a project called E-Herbarium for 2023, a series of fictional plants realized with stable diffusion. There's also a whole section on click workers, on micro-labor, and that is a little bit related to the question I asked before, because the way in which contemporary artists are tackling this world of often clandestine, hidden, underpaid, underprotected work is by really denouncing this new kind of sub-proletarian class that is emerging and that is mostly located in the global south. We have a new installation by Hito Steil entitled Mechanical Kurds, which stems out of a trip that she made to a series of refugee camps in northern Iraq, in part of Kurdistan, and where she met people in those camps working to do exactly these tasks of image annotation. And the installation also shows that in some cases these training sets are used to train driverless unmanned vehicles such as drones, which may eventually be employed by the Turkish army against the Kurds themselves. So Hito Steil tries to kind of unpack some of the very, very complex and often tribal tragic dynamics that are in this area. And another work also dealing with micro labor is by a group of young artists from Rotterdam called Meta Office. It is called Behind the Screens of Amazon Mechanical Turks. And what they did was to contact thousands of Turkers, asking them to show images of their workspaces, which can often be a bed or some kind of space somewhere in the world, documenting also the hourly wage that they receive. And you can see here, it's not a very, it's a bit of a distant image, but this column here shows for each worker their code, the code identification that they have in the system, their location, and the hourly wages, which can vary from the highest that I've seen was $24 per hour, but I've also seen many that were below $1 per hour, like 60 cents per hour, 80 cents per hour. So I think that it's very important to remind us of the presence of this kind of layer of human labor, anonymized human labor, working under very, very dire conditions and contributing these tasks of annotation, but also content moderation and so on. And another thing that I wanted to add, to just briefly present the exhibition, if I can find my arrow again, is the fact that we have a number of vitrine which we call time capsules, and which provide moments of genealogical, media, archaeological perspective that try to position the current transformations in a historical context. For example, we try to show how the current face and emotional recognition systems often inherit, without it being necessarily overt and explicit, a whole series of assumptions stemming from the very problematic history of physiognomics, criminal physiognomics, social physiognomics, racial physiognomics, including the famous text by the American psychologist Paul Ekman from the 1960s, who argued, and this theory has been vastly criticized, and that all human emotions, whatever their cultural provenance and so on, could be reduced to a number of 6 fundamental emotions. In another time capsule, we have an attempt to position the current technologies of machine vision in the longer history throughout the 20th century of attempts to automatize visual perception. For example, even mentioning filmmakers such as Dziga Vertov, Jean Epstein, who in the 1920s and 30s thought of cinema, and in particular of the film camera, as a mechanical eye that could provide a sort of displacement of human vision, a decentering of human perception, offering another perception, another way of seeing the visible world. And Jean Epstein in 1946 published a book called The Intelligence of a Machine, in which he theorized the cinema as an autonomous entity endowed with its own agency, its own capacity of understanding the visible world. So a key concept in the whole exhibition articulation, the whole exhibition structure, is the one of latent spaces, and that is also the topic on which I have written my text in the catalog. So what I'd like to offer here is some remarks on a possible theory of latent spaces, focusing on this idea that they act as what I call meta-archives, meaning spaces within which huge parts of digital culture, as it ends up being uploaded on the internet being itself an archive, often messy, complex, but an archive. Huge quantities of cultural memory that are stored on the internet are encoded and positioned in these latent spaces in vectorial forms, as vectors. And it's there that they are processed in different ways to then generate content, images, texts, sounds, which are in a way variations of these archival contents. So let me begin with a definition, with some initial statements, and I believe that a theory of images and visual culture today needs a theory of latent spaces. In a historical phase in which AI models intervene more and more in the ways in which images are captured, generated, modified, seen, and described, we need to understand the crucial role played by an abstract mathematical construct whose political implications could hardly be overestimated. Latent space, as many here know, also often called embedding space or vector space, is a foundational concept in machine learning and so-called artificial intelligence. It refers to the abstract mathematical space within which the vast quantities of images and texts that are contained in the training sets of the current generative AI models are represented in a more simplified, compressed, lower dimensional form. In order to capture underlying patterns, structures, and relations within the training data, and in order to process such data through different mathematical operations. Latent spaces are made of vectors, which represent data points in a multi-dimensional space. And each vector, with its number of dimensions, represents a specific data point with its number of coordinates. And these capture some of the specific features or attributes of the data point and determine its position in relation to other data points. This is a possible representation of a 100-dimensional vector, and the latent spaces of generative AI models today may have hundreds or thousands of dimensions. As an integral component of deep learning neural network, latent spaces are having a profound impact on contemporary visual culture. Their role is complex and multifaceted and touches all aspects of our relations with images. We find them in machine vision technologies and face and emotional recognition systems, which are widely applied across the internet and across visual culture, and they are turning the internet as well as social media platforms into vast spaces for data collection and aggregation. We also find latent spaces, of course, in AI models used for image generation and modification, as well in recommendation systems. And if you think about the main deep learning architectures that have been transforming the field of images and visual culture over the last 15 years, all of them, in a way or another, recur at some point to this form of compression and vectorization. I don't have the time to go, of course, in depth in this, but you find latent spaces in the convolutional neural networks used for machine vision, object detection and classification. You find them in variational autoencoders, in generative adversarial networks, in the CLIP model that we have already mentioned, which produces a common embedding space for both images and texts. And you find different kinds of latent spaces also in the way in which latent diffusion models work, be it the CLIP space, which encodes the words of the prompt and guides the denoising process, or in the different passages across the UNet of the denoising process itself. So in a way, with diffusion models, we could say that it is the way in which the prompts are embedded and encoded by CLIP that steers the diffusion models and leads from noise to the appearance of images. Now, all this has very, very important epistemological implications. Latent spaces, also called embedding spaces or vector spaces, as I said, are spaces in which large quantities of digital cultural objects, such as texts and images, are represented in a compressed lower dimensional form in order to capture some of the underlying features and process them through different mathematical operations. And this process of compression is quite impressive. In the case, for example, of stable diffusion, version, the only model that was released in open access and of which we know the training set, which is Lion 5B. The 5 billion text-image pairs of the training set were compressed in a model that, if you download it on your computer and operate it locally, weighs about 6 gigabytes, like a medium-sized film file. So we're talking about a huge process of compression that, as two scholars with whom I am constantly in dialogue, Leonardo Impet, based at Cambridge, and Fabian Offert, as you see, Santa Barbara, they describe this kind of compression as a form of epistemic compression, a compression of knowledge, the knowledge that was gathered in Lion 5B, that allows not only for the representation of existing data, but also for the production of new data. So a kind of compression that is very different from the compression that a JPEG format does with an image, or an MP3 with the sound. It is not only about reducing a single file size, it's about capturing huge amounts of data and vectorizing them and capture also their relations. Now, these latent spaces are also spaces of media transformation. They are spaces in which digital objects existing in various media, for example, in the form of texts, music, images, and so on, are compressed and turned in the unifying metamedium of vectors that allows, as again Offert and Impet say, for a universal commensurability. You can operate on these vectors and then you can go back to different media forms. But latent space is a form of, as they say, media collapse, a moment in which differences between media are neutralized by turning everything into numerical vectors. Now, latent spaces are part, we could say, of a large process of vectorization of culture, with very important epistemological and political implications. They turn, as I said, every cultural object, whatever its context, whatever its genesis, its social process of production and reception, into vectors. And they also act, latent spaces, through vectorization as spaces that transforms our relation with the past, with history and with cultural memory. And in many ways, as I'll try to explain in a moment, their role has some analogies, even though these are also limited, with the role historically played by institutions such as library and archives. This leads me to the question of how to position latent spaces in a longer history of the encoding and the processing of cultural memory. If we try to understand how to position them in history, we may look at different traditions, and this is a work that has been done. We can look at the theory of vector spaces and vector arithmetics. We can look at the history of statistics, of psychometrics, neurobiology, also library information retrieval systems. But what I suggest is to think of latent spaces from the point of view of cultural techniques, from the point of view of those techniques that are used to compress, position, project. And so in this, interpreted in this way, latent spaces have something in common with maps as a form of a reduction to 2 dimensions of very complex 3-dimensional structures. They have something in common with forms of a projection and a representation, such as linear perspective. They have something in common with grid-based systems of representation, such as the ones that we find in the history of treatises of perspective, such as Dürer on the left, or also in the history of urban planning. And of course, they also have something in common with archives and libraries, with their catalogs, indexes, and card files, as systems within which vast quantities of cultural objects are positioned, encoded, organized in order to then be processed by readers. If we look at a film such as Toute la mémoire du monde by Alain Resnais, a film of 1956, All the World's Memory, about the National Library in Paris, these films shows the functioning of this huge organism of the National Library as a series of processes of collecting cultural objects, cultural documents, such as books, newspapers, indexing them, assigning to each object a kind of numerical, indexical position in the system, position them spatially in spaces from which they can be retrieved, distributed, circulated. And then we finally reach in the last part of the film the space where all this memory is that has been positioned, encoded, processed, and so on, is actually the object of a further work that will produce new cultural objects. So in many ways, the latent spaces of generative AI models play a role that has some elements in common with these institutions, such as libraries and archives, with some very important differences, among which the fact that in latent spaces, you cannot find the exact objects that were encoded and vectorized. Latent spaces are not spaces for retrieval, they are spaces for transformation. The process of compression, of vectorization is so complex and so intense that actually when you generate elements out of it, you do not find exactly what was placed in it. You find always variations, transformations of them. So this leads me to some of the political issues that are raised by these systems. The first one being their utter inaccessibility, their utter invisibility. We're used to think of spaces only in 3 dimensions. We can add maybe a 4th dimension with time. We cannot imagine, perceive a space that has hundreds or thousands of dimensions. And this makes latent spaces as a typical example of the so-called black box AI technologies. Latent spaces are also plural. There's as many latent spaces as there are trained AI models. There's not one single latent space. In our current context, there's many different models produced by different companies, and only a handful of them is actually available as open source. Most of them are closed and function in ways that we cannot fully investigate. In other words, there is no unified latent space of culture. There's not even a system of translation from latent space to latent space. Each model is in a way sealed from the others and becomes a sort of ecosystem of its own. Latent spaces also today intervene profoundly in contemporary visual culture and play a role in distinguishing between what can or cannot be visualized, between the visible and the sayable, between forms and the formless. The process of image generation through diffusion, in a way, is a process of generating images out of noise. And again, it is language and especially the clip embeddings that steer this model. So let me now come to the final part of my talk, because I see that time is running. Latent spaces as meta-archives. And this is something that I have observed in preparing this exhibition and in selecting the works. A lot of artists have engaged with generative AI models in a way that treats them as spaces of possibilities, spaces of possible images that exist in a state of latency and that can refer to a series of variations of the past, to possible pasts, counterfactual histories, fictional memories, and so on. I'd like to mention here this recent book by Alexander Kluge, whose title in German is Der Konjunktiv der Bilder, the subjunctive of images. And he talks about AI-generated images as images that have the grammatical mood of our sense of what is possible. The specific modality, he writes, of images used to visualize hypotheticals and heterotopias. So this means that many artists have engaged with the presence of these abstract entities and their role in processing huge quantities of cultural objects and cultural memory and producing somehow variations of this memory. And among the projects that we have in the exhibition that use generative AI models in this sense, I'd like to mention at least three. The one is by Eric Bulot. It's a project entitled Cinéma Vivant, Living Cinema, from 2024. And Eric Bulot has been very interested now for a number of years in the history of what he calls cinéma imaginaire, imaginary cinema. A cinema that is made of unrealized film projects, but also a cinema whose traces, kind of utopian imaginary cinema, whose traces can be found across the history of literature. For example, in the writings of writers such as Raymond Roussel, Ferdinando Pessoa, and others. And for the project that he presented in our exhibition, Eric Bulot decided to take as a starting point a series of notes by the symbolist French writer Saint-Paul Roux, entitled Cinéma Vivant, in which Saint-Paul Roux describes a future cinema that would kind of develop beyond the movie theater, using the sky as a projection surface, producing images that are three-dimensional and have a kind of a crystalline dimension. And Bulot generated a series of images that try to somehow visualize this idea of cinema that can be found in Saint-Paul Roux's writings. These are images that he generated using a model called Lexica, which is one of the ways to access stable diffusion. And if one looks at the opening page of the opening interface of the model, one finds these typical examples of AI slop, all these kind of stereotyped kitschy images that are kind of the default mode of many of these models. And by working very meticulously with prompts, Eric Bulot was able of leading the model far away from these default modes and visualize area of latent space that are completely different. And a few months ago, he also published a book entitled Cinéma Vivant, in which he goes back to this project, among other things, and he writes about the specific temporality of the AI-generated images and about the way in which they emerge out of latent space. And he talks about them as, I quote from an English translation, a temporality in the past conditional that allows to imagine forgotten utopias as a speculative archive. This idea that latent spaces provide us with some kind of an archive is also at the basis of the work of another French artist, Gwenola Wagon, in a film that is present in the exhibition entitled The Chronicles of the Black Sun, which is developed through a specific reference to Chris Marker's La Jetée. In the film, we see a number of archival images that are progressively modified by through different applications of AI. We see images referring to a series of astronomical expeditions by the astronomer Jules Janssen in the 19th century. And Gwenola Wagon, together with Pierre Cassonogues, have recently published another book entitled Images pyromanes, théorie fiction des IA génératives, pyromanic images, theory fiction of generative AIs, in which, again, they talk of latent spaces as unarchives. They write, AI images are part of an unarchive, a generalized archive in which several versions of the same events, several versions of reality coexist. The unarchive of generative AI includes both anachronism and anarchy. And it transforms not only the traditional archive, but also the very essence of time. The same idea can be found in another installation that we have in the exhibition by the French artist Grégory Chatonsky, entitled The Fourth Memory, in which Chatonsky places viewers in a kind of a post-human extinction scenario in which the planet has become completely uninhabitable due to climate change. What's left is only a number of data centers containing huge quantities of cultural memory left by the disappeared humans. And this memory is constantly processed by different generative AI models that generate endless variations of them. And we see appearing on the screen a series of images that are kind of automatically generated by this model, which Chatonsky has trained locally with his own, with the downloaded version of Stable Diffusion. And we also hear voices that comment, describe these images, and that are also generated by AI. So what I'd like to close with is the idea that if 20 years ago, the art critic Hal Foster published a famous text on October in the journal October in 2004 entitled An Archival Impulse, in which he analyzed the presence of a tendency to deal with the archive, with its materiality, with its form of processing memory across contemporary art. I think that what we're facing now, at least in some part of contemporary artists and filmmakers engaging with these technologies, is a new kind of archive impulse, a kind of an interest in exploring the ways in which the different latent spaces that are present across our culture act in filtering, encoding, vectorizing, processing, transforming memory. And producing these kind of variations, these counterfactual histories, these possible pasts that we find in many of the works in the exhibition. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Antonio. We have time for one question, if there's any.
Hello. Thank you for this. It was amazing. So my question, it's kind of two. One, do you think we need a universal latent space? Do you think that would be useful instead of having those closed source? And then also, in this new era of like generated images, what is the role? What is your take on the role of the artist? What should the artist look on these generated things, and how we should conduct these things?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I really hope we do not move towards one generalized latent space. On the contrary, I hope for an extreme diversification of models and spaces, because the situation we have right now with this kind of AI oligarchy that is forming, especially in the West, with a number of leading companies kind of monopolizing this field, is really very, very problematic, because latent spaces are not at all neutral form of encoding and vectorizing. The very definition of vectors indicates something that captures coordinates, but also position them and somehow defines a direction. Latent spaces are not neutral. They are not they do have gravitational forces within them, we could say. They do tend to produce certain images rather than others and so on. So I'm really hoping that we developed in the direction of diversification of latent spaces, that there's a lot of also open model that users can modify, can, through techniques of fine tuning and so on, adding images, adding elements in them instead of using them as a kind of ready-made. And the role of artists, I think, is about helping all of us exploring this new reality, and especially working with these technologies in new, diverse ways, sometimes kind of counter-hegemonic, exploring areas of latent spaces that are less immediately visible and so on. And in selecting the artists in the exhibition, I really tried to select the ones that had a critical approach to all this, a critical, reflexive, not critical necessarily in the sense of negative, but aware and reflexive. And I think it's very, very important, especially in a historical and political moment in which we see massive quantities of so-called AI slop circulating on the internet and being weaponized by political figures such as Musk and Trump and even the White House official account, as in the case of this infamous Ghibli-style image. So I think that faced with this, it's very, very important that we encourage a diversification of the field, that artists really explore these models against the grain in a way.
Okay, thank you very much again, Antonio, for this wonderful presentation.